Welcome, welcome, welcome to the 2016 New York City Drone Film Festival. We have an amazing set of panelists on this legal and policy panel today. We're going to discuss some of the relevant issues that are going on within the drone sector. I'd like to invite on stage Gretchen West, who's a senior advisor for innovation and technology at Hogan Lovells. Is that good? Mark J Connot, partner at Fox Rothschild and the writer of On the Radar. Steve Cohen, the president of the New York City, New Jersey Drone Users Group Network. National, he's national. And of course, Jon Reznick, policy lead at DJI. All right, so as an aerial cinematographer myself, I am constantly being asked questions about what's legal, what can we do, where can I fly? You know, I mean, the rules seem like they're constantly changing. Whether they are or not is kind of unclear sometimes. I know as a 333 exemption holder myself, it seems like they're pretty clear, but you know, when we cross all these different lines between state and federal, things change. So anyway, the reality is that, you know, it's an interesting and kind of mixed bag of truth and false and whispers and little birdies and whatnot. But thankfully, the people I have here on the stage with me these are the people that are making the changes. They're spending their time in Washington to speak on behalf of drones, to try to integrate us into the airspace. Tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing.
Sure. I'm Gretchen West. I'm a senior advisor at Hogan Lovells law firm. I'm a non-lawyer in the firm, so but I've been in the industry, the drone industry and the unmanned systems industry for about 12 years. Really kind of started out on the military side, but got real passionate about the commercial side, as we've seen a lot of growth over the last just 3 to 4 years on the commercial side. So I've managed my prior association. I managed our government affairs department and business development. So I've been in the industry really promoting success of these companies and also promoting technology on Capitol Hill and trying to really open up the airspace. And what we're doing now at Hogan Lovells, we have a UAS practice group where we're really kind of pushing Capitol Hill on behalf of our clients to really open up the airspace and kind of focus on some of the challenge areas to enable commercial operations. We're also setting up a nonprofit association that's dedicated to commercial enterprise end users, which I think is a underrepresented voice in this issue. And it's called the Commercial Drone Alliance. And so we're going to be kind of looking at some of the major issues that this industry faces, such as the public perception issue, the challenges about being able to fly beyond visual line of sight, flying over people, flying at night, some of the areas that we're probably not going to see any leeway from the FAA in the near term. So we really kind of want to pull the industry forward and work against some of those challenges.
I'm a partner at Fox Rothschild and chair of the UAS practice group. And my involvement in this industry has been about 3.5 years. So I'm a toddler compared to Gretchen's decade plus of experience. But it's an exciting field on several levels. And from a legal perspective, it encompasses every area you can imagine, as well as just the policy issues that are out there. And I applaud what Hogan Lovells is doing, is taking a lead on the policy side and bringing on somebody that has a wealth of experience, but also as a non-lawyer to look at these things. But you know, each of us, and I stress this with my clients and friends all the time, you know, lobbying at the state level is huge as well. You know, there's a policy direction in DC. You may or may not have a connection there, but you can certainly work with your legislatures and even local to make sure. I mean, just last year there were 168 bills enacted by 45 states affecting drones, and that is, in my opinion, ridiculous. A lot of these drone-specific laws, they don't need drone-specific laws. For example, privacy. You know, privacy law has been around for centuries. You don't need it specifically for drones. And trespass law, similarly. So those types of issues, and you know, that's sort of my passion, is to work with, you know, commercial as well as nonprofits, do some pro bono work for nonprofits that are trying to push the policy forward.
As a leader of the Drone User Group Network, I've kind of found myself the accidental advocate. Kind of came into this out of a passion for the technology about 5 years ago, And since that time, kind of just naturally flowed into speaking my mind, whether you really care to hear it or not. But we're kind of in the clinches. I think that what Gretchen and others on this panel are really working for and aiding is for our very community and the survival and the success of recreational and commercial use of this amazing technology. I find myself educated on a daily basis just from our members and from people in the community that are doing amazing things. I've branched out into STEM education as a result of it. And so I feel that working together on the sort of ground level, grassroots movement that this is becoming to really be my forte, my wheelhouse. And I'm really happy to be on this panel and seeing how we can all work together to join forces and really have a seat at the table in terms of how legislation is affected and what we can do to serve our interests.
I'm Jon Reznick. I'm a policy lead for DJI. I also come to this from kind of the backside. I was a television journalist for a long, long time, and I started the drone news gathering program at Associated Press. And once we started that, we then started learning some very hard lessons about the regulatory environment in the US. And I needed to take on some expertise in that area, which eventually led me to DJI, where now in DJI we're working constantly to promote as much availability to the sky as possible, as low level of burden as necessary in order to ensure safe flight. We do that through things like promoting the micro rule and the new amendment for that. We also do that by advocating both federally and on the state and local level. And I can't emphasize enough how important that has become. He said 160 bills enacted. I think our last count is right now there are over 600 bills in state legislatures that are at sub-level of consideration. And so a big part of our job is trying to also just keep up with that and reach out to folks like you in the grassroots, because that's where we can have the most positive impact. So we're always trying to expand opportunity and usage. At the same time, we're always on the lookout for times when folks might want to pull back some of those rights.
So I think probably the best place to start would be at the beginning, which is what's going on with 333s, the micro rules, all the things. Where are we right now?
How much time do we have? I actually have a question first. How many of you are actively flying drones today? Not today, but actively. Okay. How about commercially? Okay. So there is a difference between commercial and recreational flying, and I don't want to go too far back into history with this issue, but it was probably in the late 90s that the FAA started to take notice of recreational and commercial use of drones, and they started to come up with some rules and guidance for how we operate. And for the longest time, there's a separation between recreation and commercial, and there's been a lot of confusion about what that means. So you can be flying a brand new Phantom 4, and if you're doing it for fun, then you're operating under some specific guidelines. The minute you start to make money off of that operation, then you're considered a commercial operator. And it wasn't until 2014 when the FAA started this Section 333 process that people were actually legally able to fly commercially. And so for so many years, people that wanted to, farmers that wanted to fly drones, or construction sites that wanted to use drones, people that were actually seeing the value were not allowed. It was illegal to fly drones commercially. And so now the FAA has set up this Section 333 process where you go through, you petition the FAA, you wait several months to get approval, then you can go out and fly. But there's still a lot of restrictions around that. And so, it's not really there's not really a good black and white answer to what you can and can't do. We've actually got a little cheat sheet on stage here that kind of outlines some of the do's and don'ts for both recreation and commercial, but it changes pretty quickly. So some of the things that are in play right now on Capitol Hill and with the FAA outside of this Section 333 process, there's a small UAS rule that we have been waiting on since 2008. Basically, this rule gives us guidance as to how we're going to be able to operate both commercially and recreationally to fly drones. We saw kind of a sneak peek of that last February, and it was actually pretty positive. I think most of us that have been in this industry a long time were not as optimistic as, we were not optimistic at all. But the small UAS rule basically said you won't need a pilot's license, you're not going to need airworthiness certification. So to be able to fly, it's going to be a lot easier. However, there will still be restrictions. You won't be able to fly beyond visual line of sight. So if you're an operator at if you work in the utility industry or oil and gas, to monitor a pipeline or a power line, it's going to be very difficult. You're not going to be able to fly over people. So if you're a broadcaster and you need to fly over people, you're not going to be able to do that. So there still were a lot of restrictions in that small rule. And where we are today with that rule, it's back with the government, it's back with the FAA. They're evaluating it. They had it open for public comment. And the FAA keeps saying it'll be released this summer. But I think from kind of those of us that are talking internally to people in the government, there's a chance we won't see it till the end of the summer, and then there's also a chance we won't see it until we get a new president. And so, we've been waiting so long on this rule that gives us guidance on how to operate, and we're going to continue to wait even longer. There's still some things that it needs to do. This rule has to go to a couple other government agencies before it gets published, and so we're still waiting on that. In the meantime, if you want to operate commercially, you have to go through the Section 333 process. A couple other things, and then I'll pass it off. The FAA reauthorization bill, it's Aviation Innovation Reform Reauthorization, what AIR. This new bill that's basically going through Congress has some good information in it, some good detail about flying UAS. However, this was, they just extended it. It hasn't been passed yet. And the last FAA reauthorization bill, which passed in 2012, had 23 extensions on it. So, to be able to rely on that for guidance, is still kind of up in the air. And then finally, the FAA has just recently announced, actually last week, that they're setting up an aviation rulemaking committee to look at micro UAS, which is great because that's kind of the area where a lot of us, I think, are operating. We're looking at 4.4 pounds or below, and that's kind of where most of these drones are, a lot of the manufacturers are making drones that size. Now, the issue is that setting up an aviation rulemaking committee has to go through that process. And again, I mentioned that 2008 small UAS rule, that was the same process. So, the hope is that the FAA can speed this up a little bit, but if they're setting up an aviation rulemaking committee for micro UAS, the hope is that it's not going to take us 5 years to get that, because 5 years from now, this technology is going to be so different. And, we're going to be operating in ways, people are going to be doing it illegally, which jeopardizes the whole industry. And so we need to kind of going back to the discussion of grassroots and all these different, kind of groups that are forming, the Drone User Group Network, the Commercial Drone Alliance. There's a lot of really good associations out there that, we as a community need to come together to really kind of push a little bit harder to loosen up some of these guidelines and make the FAA and Congress work a little bit more aggressively.
It's kind of important not to get confused. The word micro is getting thrown around a lot right now, and there are actually different levels of micro that are being considered. The first is an amendment you might have heard of in the FAA Reauthorization Act, which is that classic, really low-level micro we've always heard about. Very low weight, remote location, reduced altitudes, not flying over people, things like that, and to have as low a burden of entry as possible for that. This new rulemaking committee, this ARC, which they're calling a micro ARC, is actually not to develop that rule that as we understand it. It's specifically to develop a rule for flying over people, for being able to fly over uninvolved people. And that's a whole, compared to what we're looking to do in micro, that's a whole different level of expectation that these systems are gonna have to meet. So the micro ARC is not really anything like the proposed micro rule that we're seeing in the FAA reauthorization. On the FAA reauthorization, we've only seen the House version, and the Senate still has to weigh in completely. So there could definitely be a long way to go. There were some good things in there, including the micro amendment, but there could definitely be a lot more extensions. They were talking about trying to privatize air traffic control, which was very controversial, and they've kind of removed that now for the bill. And folks say they want to move things along, but anytime folks say that in Washington, you take it with a grain of salt.
Well, I think that's just so relevant because in a lot of the conversations that I'm having with people like John and people like Brendan Schulman, VP of Policy for DJI, is that this process takes so long that it's so important that we get it right now, because anything that, look at the act in 2012. I mean, here we are 4 years later, and we're still kind of mincing what that is and what it means and how it moves forward. It's important we really pull together and advocate as a community to do it well and to do it right and to have the right voices at the table. I'm particularly interested on the education side. I think it's almost, and I throw this word around, criminal that colleges and high schools can't fly drones on their fields to educate students and to have them build and fly drones. That if you've got a Cohen, a 333, you basically can't build your own. You've got to go off an approved list or work on some sort of experimental model that is full of red tape, and it's really depriving a whole generation of students the ability to have access to the technology right here and now. So I really think that we need to work together to fix that.
A lot of it comes from that traditional aviation thinking, the difference between a commercial operation and a recreational or personal operation. And the standards for commercial are much higher in manned aviation because you actually have responsibility for the souls on board. We're started applying a lot of principles to commercial to unmanned aviation when they're not really applicable because you don't have souls on board that we need to be protecting. So, from our point of view, we're always trying to promote the idea not so much between commercial or recreational, but a safe operation is a safe operation. And whether or not you're making a dime for that really is not relevant to how you are actually doing the operation. The 333 process, quite frankly, there's something like 30 or 31 requirements for a 333 operation, they're almost setting people up to fail, to not be able to be fully compliant because it's so burdensome. So let's get to the idea of what is going to keep things safe and not dither so much about whether or not somebody's making a dime off of it.
Exactly. And when it comes to the issues with schools, to follow up on those comments, if you can think of a more exciting technical aspect to get middle schoolers and high schoolers involved in from a STEM perspective, I mean, this is the technology. I mean, this is the industry that can grab them and excite someone who's in 4th, 5th, 8th, 9th grade and say, maybe I will take more science and engineering and math courses. And, that's the area that we're probably the most efficient in our educational system. And so that opportunity exists out there, and there shouldn't be this, then that's a commercial endeavor, and so we're going to make this recreational commercial distinction. Both as citizens as well as from the governmental perspective, we ought to be doing everything we can to push that along and encourage these kids to become involved in that area.
Definitely. So, who here is just a hobbyist and just wants to know about flying drones and where they can just fly their drones?
You can fly wherever the hell you want.
Thanks, DJI.
Stay away from airports.
So, I mean, can somebody just clear that up right now? Like right now, what is the deal if you're not making money and you just are a hobbyist and you want to fly? Can you fly?
I think I'm probably best suited to answer that question. It depends on where you are. I'm particularly challenged as representing a New York City-centric community locally, and it's I can't tell you how many times on our our forums or our Facebook or whatever. Hey, does anybody know where I can fly in New York or can I fly in Central Park? And my answer is I know, and the answer is no. It's in New York City proper. It's down. And we know people who've been arrested for flying in East River Park, right? It could have been you had you been there that morning, right?
Yes.
You know, sorry.
And that's
buddy.
actually the worst, honestly, because I love flying. I mean, I fly all the time, and
Yeah.
we were flying in this one park, and it was amazing. We'd race, I mean, we weren't going higher than 25 feet, just racing around this empty baseball field in the morning. And then when somebody got arrested, all of a sudden, people got spooked, and nobody showed up anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And from a jurisdictional standpoint, I don't know that the police were in the right. The charges were dropped, but and this is something that I come up against all the time. We have a faction of the community that sort of skews toward libertarian, and says, out of my cold, dead hands will I remove my controller. I'm going to fly wherever I want. And that's a great attitude to take, provided you've got good attorneys and some intestinal fortitude.
And a lot of time. to
And a
go to
lot of
court.
time. Yeah.
And a big bankroll.
Well, exactly. I mean, there's a difference between being right and being in legislative hell. So
Well, I was just going to say, and that's why it's kind of so important on a grassroots level that people really deal with local ordinances as they come up. It's really hard, but there's so much of a patchwork of regulations and not even necessarily laws, some parks policies or marina policies. And to be able to keep up with what all those are is very, very challenging. And some of them, might not be legal as well. Some rules that municipalities make up actually step on the FAA's turf. And eventually those have to be adjudicated and all that. It's much better if we get to them early and stop them before they actually kick in.
And that's where constituents count. I mean, honestly, it's even more at a local or state level. A lot of times, it's just keeping aware of what's going on, emailing your legislature, even if it's simply to say, or your local council person or whoever it might be, to say, I'm against this. Because what often happens is you might have one lead sponsor of the bill or two or three sponsors of the bill at the local level. Everybody else is just following whatever the herd does. And if they don't even necessarily read what they are. So you don't have to write a 3 or 4 page letter or even a 3 or 4 paragraph letter, 2 lines, and they count noses. And if it's 500 of my constituents are against this and only 3 spoke in favor of it, then I'm against it. And without even looking at the content or the substance. And so that can be key and important. So become involved and just pay attention. And it takes 30 seconds to send that email and do it.
And wherever you're flying, you want to be as compliant as possible to what the FAA guidance already is in terms of altitude minimums and proximity to people and stuff like that. You also now want to remind everybody, if you're flying as a hobbyist, you're supposed to be registered with the FAA, and your drone is supposed to have its registration number on it. So, and local law enforcement has been fully briefed on that whole process. And some of them even have little checkoff cards too when approaching drone operators. So you want to make sure you have that stuff with you in order. You might inadvertently be in a place where you're not supposed to fly drones, but if you're doing it in a really non-compliant fashion, that is not going to go well for you. If you're compliant, except for, oops, I didn't realize this is a wrong place, generally they're going to say, move along.
And from a practical perspective, why that's so important for you is liability concerns. So even if you went and done everything you could to have drone-specific insurance, and you've got insurance coverage that covers your operations, most policies include an illegal acts exclusion. Now, they can talk about what the level of that is, and you can end up in a debate if it's not purely criminal with your insurance company, but you don't want to be in a coverage position. By a like token, even if it doesn't affect your insurance policy, from a liability perspective, attorneys are going to be salivating over the fact that they can put in front of the finder of fact, a jury, that, look, they weren't even compliant with the ordinances and regulations that they were supposed to be operating under. So that's why it's critical that you make sure, not only from its good business practice, not only does it make sense, not only do you not want to be in trouble, it opens you up to a whole host of liability concerns if you're not compliant with all of those ordinances and regulations.
Even potentially careless and reckless enforcement from the FAA, which can be a serious business.
Yeah, I mean, that stuff would really ruin your day. I'm sorry, Gretchen, do you want to jump in?
No, I just wanted to get back to the question of what you can and can't do, and it's a real challenge to find the information of what you can and can't do. So, historically, the AMA, the Academy of Model Aeronautics, has represented the hobbyist community, and AUVSI, my former association, kind of represented the military community. And that was it. That was really all that was out there. And now we have this whole new community of users, whether, kind of consumer, prosumer, commercial users that are, that's probably bigger than those other those two communities combined, and it's growing at an incredibly rapid pace. The future of this industry is going to be in that marketplace. And so, you've got, for example, a real estate agent who just happens to think a drone is a cool toy that can get some really good imagery. They're not aware that this is called an aircraft by the FAA and that there are rules of the air that they have to follow. And so, there's a lot of people out there that are flying that just don't know, and it's not intentional. It's just that they don't understand the rules. And so finding where to go to understand is really difficult. There's a website called Know Before You Fly, which is very high-level information about, what you can and can't do. But even if you call your local FAA office, you might get differing information than what you're going to get from FAA headquarters. So, it's a really difficult situation. I just encourage everyone just needs to kind of understand that there are rules of the air. These are not just toys. These are considered aircraft. And so we're trying, those of us that are advocating on behalf of the industry, we're trying to make the rules less restrictive so we can open up this industry. But at the same time, we need users to understand that there are rules that need to be followed so that we can really promote safety and reliability in this industry. But, it's hard. It's hard to know where to go to find the information.
Jon, do you know about that checklist you were mentioning that the cops may have and what could potentially be on it?
Yeah, I've seen it posted on a bunch of social media. The FAA a while ago gave guidance to local law enforcement about how to approach drone incidents and the process that the FAA has to go through if they're going to launch an enforcement action. And it's all about, how you gather evidence, what has to be witnessed, a whole host of different things like that. For the most part, most of the guidance I've seen for local police departments have been okay. I think sometimes the information leans a bit too heavily on the penalties aspect of not registering for a drone operator, which can be something like $30,000 in fines for not registering a half-pound drone, which is kind of silly. The rest of them are just things like knowing what those basic guidelines are supposed to be and assessing whether that person is flying within those guidelines. But then you also get into, when you start getting into localities, you also get into all the potential privacy issues, personal property issues, which is a big deal right now, trying to figure that out. And you see lots of localities trying to legislate that you can't fly, say, over a neighbor's property. And the whole question about, just how much right do you have to the airspace over your home is really, really challenging, because our whole aviation system is predicated on the fact that you can fly over someone's home without asking permission. That's how we can crisscross the country. So at what point do you have to start asking permission? Or do you have to start asking permission? A lot of localities are trying to enact laws like that, and a lot of police departments are trying to kind of use some of their own current privacy laws to enforce, peeping Tom laws and stuff like that. But where the boundaries are can be really challenging.
Well, just to reinforce what you're saying, Jon, it borders on the Byzantine. As an example, we were planning a flying meetup not long ago on, I want to say it was Roosevelt Island, and spoke to the Parks Department on the phone. Hey, we want to apply for a permit to 10 or more people is a public gathering, but I was very, very specific about what it was that we were doing. Oh yeah, sure, go right ahead. If you're going to do that, you're going to want to be on this side of the island, so on and so forth. And then before I went ahead and pulled the plug and spent my $29 on a permit, I then looked at the sectional, and we're in Class B airspace, and we're too close to air. So there's all this contradicting and sort of fluid interpretation. Could we have flown there? Well, probably not. Would we have gotten away with it? Probably. Do we want to take that chance in this current climate? No. I mean, I think that at one point there was talk that these aren't aircraft, they're flying cameras. And that ship really sailed very quickly as far as, the FAA was concerned. But, and I've used this analogy before that this is really, we're like Model T, Model A era in terms of the industry and the technology. And we've got the buggy whip makers making the rules right now. But the other thing that I just want to impress upon, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but as someone who could get rolled up on by the 5-0, that you want to be an ambassador and not angry and surly, because you represent everybody else when you're doing what you're doing, for better or for worse. So that's just my take on it right now, is to try and abide by the rules that we have and try and change them the best we can. But be conscious that you do represent a community.
And it can be hard. I mean, look, you guys might be familiar. The guidance says you should notify if you're within 5 miles of an airport. If you look in New Jersey, there's no place you can be in New Jersey without being within 5 miles of multiple airports and heliports, because it includes every heliport that's charted, and these could be heliports that haven't been used for years and years. And there's really no guidance. Okay, so I tried to call up folks. Nobody answered the phone. I have no idea where to call. I did my best to comply. And are you saying I can't fly? Well, they're really not clear about that. And there's probably really not a rule about that. But people want to try to be compliant. And so it leaves you kind of trepidatious, shall I say.
So as a 333 exemption holder myself and the operator, the owner of a aerial cinematography company, it's really annoying for me to not be able to fly, especially because I like flying so much. I mean, I like using the camera in the two-man team, but I also like to fly, and certain times it's more safe to be flying, for me to be flying, than others, because having a pilot's license and being an amazing UAS pilot don't necessarily correspond. They're totally different skills, aside from knowledge of aviation, just general aviation knowledge and about the airspace. So my question to you guys is, what is going on with the 333 process? What's going to happen in 1 year when all of them lapse? And when are we going to be able to, if you guys know or have any ideas, when are we going to be able to just apply for a license? And what does that look like? I mean, basically, let's talk about that whole, Michigas.
The 333s will basically be superseded by the new rules that come out. Now, Gretchen's heard it could be, I've been promised many times that it's going to be June that the new rules will be coming out. And they're going to be called Part 107. That's kind of the aviation, the section of the FAA code that is going to apply there. And the good thing about these rules, at least the way they've been initially proposed, is they really don't separate between commercial or hobbyist operation. They just set out the parameters for all kinds of operations. So you won't need to be a licensed pilot anymore. You will have to get an operator certificate, and they're proposing that you'll have to go to an FAA test center to take a knowledge test for that. You won't have to take a flight test, but you will have to take a knowledge test. And importantly, anytime you get a certificate from the FAA, by statute, you have to go through a background check with DHS as well. So that could become a lengthy process. But once you get it, you'll be able to fly without, do a lot of those 333 type operations without having to have a pilot's license, without the 200-foot limitations that we see on the blanket COAs won't be there anymore. They're proposing a 500-foot limit. A lot of legislators want to throttle it back to 400, so we'll see how that plays out. I'm sorry, I don't mean to hog the stage. You guys know about this too.
So I think we've all been promised June, and we've heard the FAA publicly state June as the release of the small UAS rule for a long time now. But just kind of the timeline that they had, it has to go from the Department of Transportation to OMB. And there's a process of where these rules bounce around the federal government. The FAA's timeline was to get that to OMB by December, this past December. Well, it still has not gone yet. So just from thinking through, that timeline, their timeline's already shifted. Now, if it went to OMB tomorrow, could it still possibly come out in June? I think it's possible. The FAA administrator just said this week in a hearing that it was coming out, that they would finish in June, which could very well mean their part finishes in June, and then they send it over to OMB. So, and this has been going on for years. Everybody tries to read between the lines, and there's been massive delays. But I think once we see this rule, right now the Section 333 process is the only way to fly commercially. You can go through a type certification process, which takes at least 2 years and a ton of money. And so really the only ones that have been successful in that have been companies that have flown their systems for the military.
What's that called? What
Type certification.
Type certification. Can you
Yeah, it's
just clarify?
experimental. It's like experimental type certification.
You don't want to do that.
But it is something that is probably, if it wasn't so time consuming and expensive, it's probably the best process to be able to fly. And the FAA has actually been promoting it. However, nobody's going to spend 2 years going through this process for flying over a construction site or something else, because the technology will be so different after 2 years. But so really the only feasible way to fly is through the Section 333 process. So let's just assume the rule comes out June, August, December, whatever it is. The FAA is not just going to flip a switch and be like, okay, now everybody can get out and fly. And so I don't know what it's going to look like, and I don't think anybody does. But there's going to be some sort of transition period, transitioning out 333s, transitioning in more broad operation. And I don't know the timeline on that, but I can't imagine that the FAA is just going to just shut down 333s and say, everybody go out and fly. That's just not how the FAA works.
Do you think that pilots now will be grandfathered into the to whatever that license is, or are they going to have to go through the process like anybody else?
I think you're going to have to get an operator certificate if you're going to fly under Part 107. Now, if you're going to fly strictly as a hobbyist, they say that model aircraft language is still going to be in there. But those are, some very specific limitations. You have to fly under the auspices of a community-based organization, following their guidelines, and AMA, as we understand, is pretty much the only community-based organization there. And if you look at some of the operations that, recreational people do, especially when you talk about kind of the whole action sports world and stuff like that, that doesn't necessarily work with some of the kind of AMA guidelines. And also just simple things. Look, how many of us hand launch and hand land our Phantoms? It's a very common practice. That in AMA guidelines, you're not supposed to touch an aircraft with its motors running. So little things like that. And they certainly, by all indications, they plan to much more closely enforce actual recreational operations. They're not going to allow for gray areas, which we've been kind of having right now.
Yeah, and there's, the gray areas, we've spent so much time with the FAA asking the questions about, so is this gray? How gray is it? Is it blacker or is it whiter? And, we got to a point where we kept using this example of a farmer. So a farmer goes out, buys a drone, flies it over his field, collects some data and information, doesn't sell anything, doesn't do anything with it. It's just, he hangs a picture on his wall, but he might see that there was a problem in the corner of his field, so he fixes that, and then he's got better yield. And so, but the FAA was very much like, okay, we can say that is a recreational activity. And then they went back and forth with their own lawyers. And then they finally came back to us because we had this whole initiative where we were going to push out for farmers to be able to fly under recreational guidelines. Then the FAA came back and said, well, if that farmer files it on his tax returns as a business expense, files the drone as a business expense, then it then becomes illegal. So now we've got the IRS involved in this, which is just ridiculous. So it's a confusing, difficult thing. And hopefully, as some of this shakes out, as some of these rules come out, we'll get to a point where we have more guidance and it's more clear about how you can fly.
I think it's time to open up to you guys and to hear what you guys have to say. We have about 20 minutes left for questions, and I think that you guys probably have a lot. So,
Hello. I was wondering, right now for 333, there's really no incentive for people to even follow the rules. So I'm a pilot. I have a 333. I obey the 500-foot from non-participating members. I've turned down probably 9 jobs in 2016, which other people did. Do you guys know of any type of enforcement that's, I've only known of 2 people, the Chicago company and then Trappy in 2012. So do you know of any enforcement?
Good question.
Yeah,
Good question.
there's a case ongoing right now in LA that somebody who was arrested and is under criminal charges for flying his drone. So the FAA is not, their mandate is not enforcement, but which is why kind of when Jon was saying about turning this over to law enforcement, they're not out there looking. They're but they do see when people post things on YouTube and it comes to their attention. But they're not driving around farmlands and looking for this stuff. But there certainly is enforcement if you're caught. I mean, just a lot of people are getting away with it.
And I think the challenge is just like, locks exist to keep honest people honest. And the regulations there are there to keep people who will comply with those within a certain set of parameters. You're going to have the cowboys. Unfortunately, you're going to have the cowboys. And one of those cowboys may very well, unfortunately, create a catastrophe that really harms the public perception. And, I mean, pretty much what you can do is everyone you speak to that's in the industry, try and make sure that they're compliant, but you're going to have the cowboys out there that don't care about what happens.
Well, and some of them, again, it goes back to knowing the rules, and it's not super easy to find what find what you can and can't do. I mean, all of us drive cars, and all of us have gone beyond the speed limit, and so but there is enforcement, even though we do that and we get away with it all the time. But it takes a village to make this happen, and so we all need to be very responsible and encourage others too, because one bad thing that happens is really going to hurt all of us in the end.
And I don't know if so much about a cowboy mentality. I hear exactly what you're talking about in terms of the challenge you face. You're trying to do everything right. But I also think the FAA has set up such a high barrier to entry into the commercial level that they've really almost created a culture of non-compliance. There are tons of really responsible people out there who are flying thoughtfully and commercially. And frankly, I think there are far more people flying commercially without a 333 exemption than there are only 3,500 333s out there. You see the Facebook posts and the different blogs. There are tons of people who are flying commercially without being compliant. And I think part of that is a creation of the FAA by creating this very burdensome process, and that people with good common sense take a look at it and say, well, gee whiz, no, I know I can fly safely without necessarily meeting all those standards. Why are they going overboard? And so it creates that difficult problem for someone like you, and there's no drone police force to do anything about it. Right now, they're laying down restrictions that are far too burdensome, and they're not making a safety case for them. Generally, if you're going to have a very strict rule, it's because there is a very specific safety case to make for it. 500 feet in our small drone world is far away, and that's a kind of a distance that has come out of manned aviation, where you're talking about much different mass and much different speeds and stuff like that. So I think the biggest problem we have in the drone world is a lack of data. We don't have data about accident rates, safety numbers, hours of operation. We do know that, just anecdotally, that our drones have been flying for millions of hours, and small drones have amassed millions of hours of flight time without really a serious accident anywhere. But that's hard to quantify. So by 333 users who are able to demonstrate a continual process of logged operations with exact information about how it went, that's going to be data that we can go back to the FAA and say, look, this 500-foot distance, this is really way overly burdensome.
Look, and also, we're going to be doing a creative panel later in the day, and the reality is, we don't need 200 feet. We don't need 400 feet for sure, for once in a while. I mean, rarely ever do clients ask for something at that height. Yeah. They want less than 100 feet. They want a dynamic shot. They want to do something
75 feet is the sweet spot.
Exactly. I mean, if you're shooting real estate, who wants to see the roof of a house? Who cares? If you're doing roof inspection, you don't want to be that high anyway. There's very few real uses for that height and that certainly that distance, the 500.
And that's why in a city like New York, you know, there are so many places you can't fly right now in New York, but there would be so many kind of beneficial uses just on that very low level. Well, a lot of time below building level, below treetop level, not part of the national air, well, not part of the navigable airspace, say. And to preclude those kind of operations, whether it's a roofer or structural inspector or just somebody checking a cell phone tower, here in the city is kind of silly. Or just folks going out racing and not flying more than 25 feet off the ground. I mean, come on, I have bucket trucks that can go higher than that.
So I think kind of to reiterate a lot of what we've said about, you know, getting involved as a community and grassroots efforts, you know, I mentioned in the beginning that the end user community is probably the least well-represented community in the drone space. And so the FAA is making decisions based on, you know, manufacturers and service providers and software providers and lobbyists and, you know, manned aviation experts coming in and telling them what the rules should be. And the FAA is just looking at this from a manned aviation perspective because that's just what they're used to. They need to hear these stories that you know, whatever percentage of you know, aerial cinematographers, you know, whatever percent, 90%, don't ever need to go over 100 feet. You know, those kinds of things can help them understand, because right now they kind of have this broad concept that everybody needs to be flying high and everybody needs to be flying far and everybody needs to be doing this. And so, you know, coming together as a community and going to talk to your local representatives and explain to them, you know, no, I don't need something that robust. I just need 100 feet and I need, you know, within a closed area. And so I think those can really help inform how the FAA makes decisions, and it can lead to giving them better data points.
So to that point, how would you best approach from the grassroots level? How would you best state that case to even to local legislation or to the FSDO office in Philly, let's say?
And that's the hard thing. I mean, we need to be doing better with coming up with end use cases and business cases. And I know some companies, some corporate companies are doing that because they want to understand, you know, is agriculture my market? Is utilities my market? And so they're probably doing some deep dives internally, looking at the end use, the value of drones for some of these communities. But I think we need to do it in a more open and collaborative way. And so this alliance that we're forming is going to tackle some of that. We can't go look at every single market right away. I mean, we'll get to what we can get to, but we need to come up with those end use cases. And to my knowledge, and I've spoken with people at the White House, I've spoken with people in Capitol Hill, nobody has those or knows, you know, nobody's really doing that in a public way. And it's that kind of thing that I think is really going to help. That's the message point. That's what you can take to Capitol Hill. That's what you can take to your local representatives. It's just we need to do those cases.
Yeah, for most of you, it's telling your story. It's telling why, you know, just as Randy mentioned here, telling why that impacts where you're at. I mean, both people on Capitol Hill as well as your state level and local level are going to be motivated when you can explain the economic benefits and the economic impacts and stress the safety component at the same time. You can say, look, these can be operated in this fashion. There's regulations the FAA is laying down. But, you know, this is the impact, and this is why it needs to be operated at 75 feet or 100 feet, as opposed to being over 250 feet or 400 feet or whatever your local ordinances want to require or restrict. So it's telling those stories.
You also want to make sure you ask the question, what problem are we trying to fix here? Because very often there's either laws already on the books, say if I mentioned before, if we talk about privacy, there are laws already on the books that would cover a drone for privacy, whether you're using a telescope, binoculars, or a drone. It's the intent of what you're doing. It's not the technology of it. And that can be applied a lot of time on legislation. They continue to apply that. We just want to apply this to drones. We're not going to apply it to cell phones or digital cameras or anything like that. So ask the question, what problem do we want to solve? And then the use cases, our safety components, all those kind of things can come into play where people, you know, have a light bulb moment and say, oh, you know what? This is safe. This is okay. We do have the rules to be able to handle this.
I'm sorry, I just want to, would there be any advantage to a voluntary de-identified data sharing from amongst hobbyists? I mean, the DJI product has pretty much got a logging software that could be even transmitted on a monthly, weekly, however basis. without any identity attached to it to provide information on that level. Does that have any value?
I think that is an interesting concept. You do run into privacy issues, how to basically do you de-identify, because location can be an identifier as well. Data is good. Being able to gather the data and respect people's privacy can be more challenging. And
I'm purely speaking on a voluntary basis.
Oh, yeah, well, right now you can do that with our stuff right now. You can upload your flight log to the cloud, and that's more intended if you want to share that with friends and stuff like that. But certainly that data, and it's in our terms of use, if you upload that data to the cloud, we will take a look at that in an anonymous fashion just to try to get a sense of operational hours and stuff like that. But we have to do a lot of extrapolating because most operators don't upload to the cloud. They might not necessarily be against it. It's just not, it's not part of their process. So we have to be careful about how we collect that information.
Thankfully. All right, let's just do a last question and then.
I think one of the approaches we need to take is to get our legislators interested in the potential tax revenue that's involved in doing things. If Steven Spielberg rolls into New York here, I'm sure they'd find a way to let him fly wherever he wants to get revenue. And not just that, but the report that AUVSI did with Darryl Jenkins, that shows state by state the potential tax revenues. You got to get that information in front. And he's actually doing a follow-up report with the Department of Commerce now, supporting that. So I think flipping the positive, yes, getting case studies and data and things like that, but we're potentially at risk. You have Amazon, doing their testing over in Canada, although I heard they brought some of that back. So from a national standpoint, really driving that down. And then there's also the problem I see of local laws. What trumps? If FAA sets the laws, Andy of Mayberry may have his own, ideas of what to do and not to do. Out in Wyoming, it's legal to shoot down a drone. They came out with a rule like that. So, anyway, 2 points.
Well, I think it's not just the tax revenues. I mean, the tax revenues are driven by the economic development. It's really focused them on the economic development, the jobs, the local impact will create the tax revenues, and so it's not just the tax revenues.
And one of my concerns is one of the results of the registration process is you're starting now to see state aviation officials check the registration rolls and start sending tax bills to people because we tax aircraft in this state, and you're going to have to pay a tax on that.
Yeah, because all they see is the end number. The state taxing authorities in some states, for example, Florida doesn't have a state income tax, but they have very aggressive on other taxes, and so without the state income tax. Nevada's the same way, where I'm from. And so the state taxing authorities, departments of revenue, they see an end number pop up. And so letters are going out from those state taxing authorities now that people are registering because, they see the end number. They don't know if it's a $400 drone that somebody got on Amazon or if it's a $40 million G5. And so, when they see that end number pop up, usually, historically, those have been high dollar transactions. So they're on the radar for those people to look at. So that's another unintended consequence.
Keep in mind, already in just the first couple of months, more people have registered than there are actually aircraft in this country. And most people who have registered a lot of time have more than one drone. So that could be a serious revenue source for a lot of states.
All right, last question.
I'm going to take this in a little different direction in terms of just who is talking to whom in various federal, state, city agencies. In most ports, the captain of the port enforces the laws, the seafaring, the SOLAS, and all the other laws that are involved in maritime safety at, quote, the discretion of the captain of the port. Is there any issue or any direction that can be made for an ombudsperson to kind of make things easier for all of the constituents?
Well, I think, the FAA reconfigured their UAS office over the past few months, and they have new leadership in there, and they expanded that leadership. And that's certainly one of their stated goals, is to be more receptive to the community, to be more empathetic to the community, and to try to move things along, not do business the same old way. I find those guys to be sincere. I find them to, but it's the government, and it's not going to move along quickly. I think they do have, I think in many ways they have, their heart is in the right place, and they're trying to move things along. But still a tough nut.
All right, on that note, thank you all for coming to this panel. Thanks to all the panelists for your time, and we will be breaking for 20 minutes, and then we're going to come back with a drone tech panel. So that's that. Thank you very much.